With the rise of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party in China in 1949, up to one-third of the world was now living under communist rule. Stands to reason that this would have a ripple effect on the area surrounding China. In this screencast, we're going to take a look at the Cold War how it affected the rest of Southeast Asia. Specifically, we're going to look at something called the domino theory, which is the central piece of the Cold War in Asia. It's defined as the idea that a political event in one country will cause similar events in others. Think of stacking up a row of dominoes, tipping the first one and watching it crash and collapse the others, an entire row. This is the idea that we applied to communism in the 1950s and 60s, both in Europe and in Asia. In that sense, it extends the idea of containment laid out by President Harry Truman in the 1940s. While we would allow communism to exist where it was already established, we, the United States, and to some extent NATO and the United Nations, would resist efforts to expand communism beyond where it already extended. This is going to bring the U.S. into two different Asian civil wars. In the 1950s, it will be in Korea, and in the 1960s, it will be in Vietnam. For the first part of the 20th century, 1910 to 1945, Korea was occupied and part of the Japanese Empire. At the end of World War II, with the Japanese Empire dismantled, Korea split into two halves, North and South, and when the North Communist government invaded the Southern authoritarian government, or non-communist South, civil war broke out. The United States, in the interest of containment, and the United Nations, in the interest of protecting a member nation, both sent troops in to support the South. Although this is very much a war in the way it was fought, technically the United States never formally declared war, and instead this conflict was labeled a police action. Nonetheless, the action was extremely heavy during the first 6 months of the war itself. The North Korean invasion was initially very successful, advancing all the way to what became known as the Pusan Perimeter in the space of just 3 to 4 months. The U.S. and United Nations forces, rather than push back directly, then tried an encircling movement, in September of 1950 landing at the port of Incheon, the idea being to circle around and surround the North Korean troops. This proved to be pretty successful as the North Korean troops were not only retreating, but ended up pushing back all the way to the Yalu River, which bordered with China. Obviously, actions have equal and opposite reactions, and in November of 1950, the Chinese government entered the war, fighting on behalf of the North Koreans, and began a pushback of their own. This generated some debate originally among the U.S. and UN forces as to whether to extend the war into China. Ultimately, the war doesn't expand into China itself, although Chinese troops will continue to fight for the remainder of the conflict, which ends in 1953 with the signing of a ceasefire. The ceasefire ultimately creates a border and demilitarized zone at the 38th parallel. However, because no formal peace treaty has ever been signed, that means that North and South continue to have tension to this day. The ultimate aftermath involved 37,000 U.S. troops killed, compared to about 3 million civilians in Korea, most through the use of aerial bombing. You may remember that from World War II. The two Koreas marked very different paths. South Korea gradually became more democratic over the years. Its capitalist economy also became very successful, ranking up as much as 13th in the world by the year 2010. North Korea remained a communist dictatorship under the Kim family, Kim Jong-il and his son Kim Jong-un, who is the current leader of North Korea. Although they're comedic figures to a lot of people, there's nothing funny about the fact that their mismanagement of their government led to massive famine in the 1990s, which killed millions of people. North Korea has also become a nuclear power, which tends to threaten not only Japan and surrounding areas, but has also drawn the attention of the United States. One last aside before we move on to Vietnam. The Korean War was also the beginning of what became known as Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, or MASH units. The idea here was pretty simple. If you could move surgery facilities closer to the front lines, wounded soldiers would have a better chance of survival. This proved to be correct, as 97 to 98% of soldiers entering a MASH were likely to survive. MASH later became known as a novel by H. Richard Hornberger, who was a Maine native and surgeon in one of the MASHs. His book was eventually turned into a successful film and then later into a long-running TV series, which some of you may have probably seen. Worth checking out if you get the chance. From here, we're going to move on from Korea to Vietnam, which follows many of the same patterns as the Korean War. Before World War II, Vietnam was also part of somebody else's empire. In this case, it was part of the French colony of Indochina, along with the nations that would become Laos and Cambodia. Ho Chi Minh, this fellow right here, a former pastry chef classically trained in French culinary arts, ultimately would lead a communist revolution in North Vietnam. And in 1954, at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French were forced out of Indochina, which ultimately created, as it did in Korea, a split between a communist North and a non-communist South. The North originally received its support from, you guessed it, the Soviets and the Chinese. The South would receive support from the United States. No active troops yet, but that would change. During the 1950s and 60s, presidents including Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, shown here, sent military advisors to train the South Vietnamese Army. In 1965, in the Gulf of Tonkin, U.S. ships were fired upon or not. It's not clear that this actually happened, but the reports of it gave the government the leverage under President Johnson, authorized by Congress, to send in combat troops. So we went from a role of advisors and economic aid to the South to providing active combat support for the South Vietnamese government and army. Over time, the U.S. would pursue a policy of escalation of its presence. In 1965, the U.S. sent 80,000 troops into Vietnam. Within 4 years, the number would be over 500,000. To put that in perspective, the army that the U.S. sent into Iraq in 2003 numbered about 1/4 of that troop size. The U.S. strategy was very simple. It's a war of attrition. The U.S. was the best funded, most well-equipped army in the world. By using their numbers, by using superior weapons and technology, they would basically grind the enemy down and be successful. This is a strategy that would work incredibly well in a traditional war. However, this was not, in fact, a traditional war. The Viet Cong were a group of rebels in the South who aided the North Vietnamese army. They countered the numbers and technology of the U.S. by using guerrilla tactics. They did not wear uniforms, instead preferring civilian clothing. They used the jungle foliage as cover for their movement and activities, combined with miles of underground tunnels. When they attacked and assaulted the enemy, they did so through hit-and-run tactics. almost never frontal face-to-face communication. This is described really well in the People Century video called War of the Flea, which is part of your Cold War playlist on YouTube, so you can check that out. Traditional war tends to be measured in casualties, and the nightly news featured a lot of statistics very much like sports scores. We killed X of theirs, they killed Y of ours. Reporters, however, were telling a different story. And in 1968, the Viet Cong launched multiple attacks known as the Tet Offensive, happening during the Vietnamese New Year. While ultimately the attacks, shown here in the map with the little red starbursts, ultimately they were not successful in holding territory and many Viet Cong were killed, it showed that the Viet Cong were far from defeated. This event began to change American public opinion as far as involvement in the war. Was containment worth this? As opposition grew, President Johnson ultimately withdraws his bid for re-election in 1968. And even a photo of him showing his scar from a gallbladder operation was fodder for political cartoons like this one from David Levine and this collage from Max Brandel of Mad Magazine, showing Vietnam as more or less the scar on Johnson's presidency. Another event that created difficulty for Americans to accept our role in Vietnam was the March 1968 Malai Massacre, in which American troops killed 300 unarmed civilians. The leader of the platoon and company that went in to Malai, William Calley, maintained that he was following orders to clear a village of Viet Cong. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and the public wouldn't learn about what happened for nearly a year and a half. When it does come out, this is going to create a tremendously negative image of Vietnam veterans, which many of our veterans are still dealing with today. Richard Nixon was elected in 1968 with the promise of getting the U.S. out of Vietnam. And while the number of troops, in fact, did start to go down, in 1969 Nixon secretly expanded the war, mainly through aerial bombing, into Laos and Cambodia. This would create protests on U.S. campuses, including the campus of Kent State University in Ohio, where 4 students were killed by National Guard troops. Ultimately, the U.S. did phase out of Vietnam, signing a ceasefire in 1973. However, fighting between the North and South would continue until 1975, when the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong captured the southern capital of Saigon, renaming it Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam was, and still is, a single nation under a communist government. The Vietnamese success had a carryover effect into the neighboring country of Cambodia, under the fellow here in the upper left, Pol Pot, and the Khmer Rouge. They ruled Cambodia from 1975 to 1979. Their intent was to turn Cambodia back into one massive collective, shades of Mao Zedong's Great Leap in China. And over the next 4 years, over 2 million people died from starvation, torture, or murder, from charges ranging from being anti-modern to being anti-intellectual. Even having a pair of reading glasses could land you in what became known as the killing fields. It is a very sad story. Ironically, the Khmer Rouge is ultimately going to be brought down by communist Vietnamese, suggesting that, hey, you guys have gone too far even for us. So ultimately, the Cold War is going to have an impact. How much of the domino theory was successful? How much of it wasn't? That's up for historians and students of history like you to decide.